If you would like to start. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our July 13th of the month. I'm going to go through a little welcoming here for you all, and then we will get started on our discussion. Just a little bit of virtual housekeeping. Just want to let you all know that your voice is encouraged and welcomed as a participant in the chat box and during our discussion and Q&A times. Given the topic for this evening, we will be making sure that we have time at the end for people to ask questions. If there's something that you want to verbalize or just kind of commiserate with us as a community, we will be having time to do that at the end. But during the event, you can also feel free, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to put that in the chat as well. Please be mindful of muting yourself while we have speakers talking, and video on is encouraged but not required, so we can feel more like a community while we're here in this space. This space is a learning community. We're so glad. Sorry, y'all. Sorry, 1 second. This space is a learning community, and you are more than just an audience. We assume that all of you are here in this space with us because you care about the work that we're doing towards racial justice in whatever ways we can. We're here to learn together. And we have some exciting events coming up. We want you all to save the date for next month, where we will be discussing environmental racism. We discussed this 4 years ago, and we had a really great conversation then, and we want to pick that up, especially, considering what's going on in our world today. So make sure you mark your calendars for that for Saturday, August 13th. And we also have another workshop going on right now called Toxic Proof Workplaces. If you are interested in registering for this workshop, please just inbox Dana. It says Dana BRJA Tech. If you want to inbox her privately now with your email address, she will connect you for how to register for that event. Just a little bit about BRJA. BRJA was officially founded in 2003 and has its roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. BRJA is a program of Fusion Partnerships, Inc., a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Also, we're on social media, and we would love to connect with you on social media. We have a YouTube channel where we not only put our 13th of the month events up, so if you miss them or if you want to share them with someone, but we also have something called short takes that we do live on Instagram, but if you miss it, we're also going to be putting those on our YouTube channel, so we would love to connect with you there. We also have a Facebook page where we announce workshops and 13th of the months and other things that are going on in our organization. We also have Twitter, so if you would like to connect with us there, please do so now, and our Instagram. So if you all would like to take a few seconds and connect with us on social media, we would love to have you. We are a nonprofit, and we appreciate any donations that we receive. If you would like to become a sustainer, you can visit us at bemoreantiracist.org /donate, and you can also donate via PayPal. Also, if you would like to do a one-time donation, again, you can do that through PayPal at bemoreantiracist.org /donate. All right, we're going to move on to our discussion for this evening. And we're going to be talking about recent decisions made by our Supreme Court. Many people were very alarmed and very aware of the Roe v. Wade decision. However, there have been other decisions that have been made literally within days of Roe v. Wade that people may not be aware of, and we're not having as many conversations about. And I want us to be mindful of all of the energy around Roe v. Wade, the fact that it was leaked to the public, 2 or 3 months before the Supreme Court made a decision on it, the fact that, the way the media is covering it, the amount of coverage it's getting, the energy it's getting, the protests. And I want us to be thinking about the fact that there have been things that have been going on in this country, during Trump's administration, things that have been going on with our current Supreme Court that haven't got as much energy, right? That haven't had the same reactions from us as a public. And I want us to be thinking about the fact that that is because Roe v. Wade affects so many white women, right? And that because it affects that demographic, that's the reason why this particular decision has gotten so much energy, so much pushback. And I want us to be thinking about the fact that there are so many other decisions that are happening that are affecting people of color and other marginalized communities that just aren't getting the same attention and the same energy. So I have on the slides 4 cases that, like I said, were made literally within days of Roe v. Wade that just you may not be aware of, like I said, because it didn't get as much attention. So one of them is the EPA decision. Like I said, next month, we're going to be talking about environmental racism in more detail about how, as global warming continues, how it specifically is going to be affecting Black people and other people of color. So the decision has limited the EPA's agency's ability to regulate carbon emissions from power plants, making it much tougher to achieve the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade. So I think that decision was made, I think maybe the day after Roe v. Wade or something like that. So again, something you may not be aware of. There was also the open carry decision. The Supreme Court, when they ruled about Roe v. Wade, they said that we're going to return it back to the states and let the states decide. They literally the next day said, no, the states can't handle open carry. We're going to decide that. So literally within a day, there was this huge flip-flop within the Supreme Court about open carry. Another really big case that was decided recently was towards Native American sovereignty. So in the case of Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta, a majority of 5 conservative justices sided with the state of Oklahoma, finding that state governments have the legal jurisdiction to prosecute non-Native citizens for crimes committed against Native citizens on sovereign tribal lands. And then we also have the Prayer in Schools decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, the Supreme Court's first case directly addressing the question. The court ruled that a school board in Washington state violated a coach's rights by not renewing his contract after he ignored district officials' directive to stop kneeling in silent prayer on the field's 50-yard line after games. He claimed that the board violated his First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and the Supreme Court's majority agreed 6-3. So I want us to be thinking about, as we're going to talk more in depth, we have 2 BRJA members here with us tonight, Christina and Ani, who are lawyers and who are going to be giving us their legal perspective about these decisions, but we're also going to be talking about it from a racial lens as well. But I want us to be thinking about the fact that although it's troubling that we currently have a Supreme Court that is so conservative leaning and that is coming for people's civil rights, I want us to be thinking about the fact that this is actually more on par with America's history. I want us to be thinking about decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, the Dred Scott case, right? That those are just 2. But historically, our country and our Supreme Court has been making decisions throughout our history that have always taken rights away from people of color in this country. So we may have been lulled by the last 30 years or so in the Supreme Court decisions to be thinking that America is actually doing things that don't infringe on people's civil rights, but that's just not our history. That's not the history of the country that we actually live in. So I just want us to be mindful of that history as we have this discussion this evening. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Ani and Christina, and I want to give them the floor and just give them some time to talk about those 4 cases that were posted, and just do either of you have some more legal background? I don't like to put a lot on slides. I don't want to bore people with the slides, but any more legal background that you want to add to the discussion about those cases?
Legal background for all four of the cases. So the one that I think stands out to me of those four is the native sovereignty one, because the sovereignty of tribes in the United States has been under attack since sovereignty was even recognized of the tribes in the United States. And the last major case I recall was, I think, in 2013, about the adoption of a Native child by a non-Native family, when the Native father did not know the child was being put up for adoption. And ultimately the Supreme Court then, which was a more liberal leaning Supreme Court, still ruled in favor of the state agency, I believe it was the state of Arizona, in placing adoption of that child with a non-Native family. And I want to highlight that because, you know, a lot of people, it's easy to kind of blame, oh, we have a more conservative Supreme Court now because we have these three Trump appointees. And that's true. I mean, for face value, they are more conservative, but the Supreme Court has been conservative, even with previous appointees. And it just shows in the United States the priorities that we have, the people that we uplift and protect, and the people whose rights we continue to marginalize. That case back then didn't really cause for a lot of alarm, even though, of course, the Native community suffered greatly and continue to do so, because that case basically allowed it so that one parent can make a decision on a Native child without the consent of the other. And now, again, more sovereignty rights are being attacked. Again, not respecting the sovereignty of a tribe is essentially not acknowledging that they are a nation state of their own. They have their own laws, that they have their own rules, and not letting them prosecute people who commit crimes against their people. Again, what is the point of saying they are a sovereignty? And it's the case that I hear the least about. So I hope that background is a little helpful for everyone, because it's no matter what the court is leaning for whatever reason, left or right, everybody on that court has always been willing to subjugate that population in particular. I don't know if Christina wants to chime in. I don't want to just keep rambling about all four cases, but.
Well, I think the sovereignty case is really interesting because the most recent, after the adoption case, was a particular case that really ruled in favor of sovereignty. So it was the same issue as this case, where the justices said, yes, you could only prosecute people who by the tribal council, or the federal system could have control over prosecution on sovereign land. And what this case is saying, Oklahoma said, you know, the federal court system is overrun. I think they handled like 4,000 cases instead of individual cases. And what they were saying is that the federal court system is overrun, and the federal system is giving very much, very lenient punishment for crimes. So what Oklahoma was saying is basically like, we should get this sovereign state is part of Oklahoma. So all of the land of Oklahoma is ours, and we should be able to prosecute who we want if they act against the Native American. Because that's the other issue with like the tribal courts, or the tribal councils that prosecute, is that they could only prosecute against other Native people. They can't prosecute people who are
Right.
who aren't Native. And what's so interesting about this case, because on the face value, you're like, yeah, because the person who they ruled against, essentially they wanted to prosecute, is this man who harmed his native stepdaughter, essentially. So when people first read this case, they're like, oh yeah, this is great. This is great. You know, now we're punishing criminals who are hurting children. That's awesome. And we're actually holding them accountable. But the issue goes right back to what Ani's saying, is that the council already had, and the federal government already had, a system to prosecute these individuals. And what the Cherokee community was saying is that this particular governor in Oklahoma is unwilling to compromise, to work with, to even enter into dialogue with the tribe. So it's a matter of like, he's just gun-ho and trying to do his own sense of justice, as much of the United States is going about doing it, that they believe they have a stronger sense of justice than others. And it goes really to that sense of, you know, and I think that what the Cherokee tribe was saying is like, hey, talk to us. If this is happening to our people, let us have a voice in how this is prosecuted. And the governor is basically like, no, no, thank you. Which really goes back to what Ani was saying, is the voices, the marginalization of Native people.
I don't mean to keep talking about just this case, but to take it back, you know, another thing I've noticed people don't realize is you don't necessarily have to have Native quote unquote blood or DNA to be considered in a tribe. Every tribe is allowed to determine their own rules on who is allowed to be in it. And that's important because that adoption case I had mentioned, the father who was in a tribe, he technically, part of what I believe it was Scalia, Justice Scalia wrote, he wasn't like ethnically Native because he actually was Black. So the anti-Blackness and not acknowledging that he could be in a tribe and the sovereignty of that tribe was not respected in admitting him in that tribe, added a different layer to that. It added to the fact that no matter who's in these courts, at the end of the day, do they really respect the sovereignty of Native nations and tribes? No, not really, not most of the time. And that affects not just Native American people as we see them or as we envision them, but even other people who are in tribes, but we would not necessarily see them in that way or see them as Native American. And then the other case I was thinking about was the EPA, which, I mean, the EPA, personally, in my opinion, never had a lot of teeth to begin with. So the little bit of power to regulate anything that they had being questioned and taken away, it just shows the corporate interest that now exists on the court. And I think that corporate interest definitely changed with these three appointees under Trump. That is so blatantly, obviously, like just business oriented, business as usual. And it just shows what happens when you have a failed legislature, because the problem is so many laws are now being determined by courts that should have been legislated properly. And we have politicians, again, who they kind of look to the issues that people want to talk about right now in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years. But I'm pretty sure we all know environmental issues, we're always just kind of putting to the side. We can get to that later when we solve this. We can get to that later if we can get these rights first. But the environmental issues are the ones that are going to also impact people of color the most.
Mhm.
And I think of all four of these cases, the EPA one is the most like egregious in terms of the justice's conflict of interest.
Mhm.
And I don't see it being discussed in that way. I don't know if Christina, putting you on the spot.
No, I definitely agree, because I think you're right. What they're balancing out is whether the president has power to rule make, and that's a whole complicated process.
Mm-hmm.
But there is it's a very structured process on how you come up with these rules, and there's waiting periods and there's comment periods, and all of this goes into it. And for the Supreme Court to say, nah, we disagree with how you're doing it, we disagree with what you're saying, I think that really speaks to the conflict that they have, where pro-business, and that's what, you know, essentially all environmental cases and regulations comes down to, is how is it impeding business, and balancing that with how it impedes how it harms people, and also global warming. So it's very climate change. So it's very much a they have to strike a balance. And right now, what the court is saying is that the balance is towards business. Progress, capitalism, the progress of moving forward as a rich first world nation, as they say, is the most important thing. Whereas, and next week, when you talk about how global warming, climate change changes and impacts people of color, I think that's really at the heart of this all, because, at the end of the day, people of color are the ones that are going to suffer the most and bear the burden of business expanding, which is not a uncommon thing for the United States. That's kind of like, they will be on the backs of people of color no matter what, especially Black people. If they could get away with it, they will. And that's what this particular decision did. It was saying we're limiting the power for rulemaking and how you control it. You could do certain things, they say, but not to the extent that you want to do cap and trade or trying to establish an equilibrium between business and the environment. So right now it's saying business is more important than how you go about doing the environment.
Thank you, Christina. Adar, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I was trying to start my video, but I cannot because the host has stopped it.
Wait, what are you trying to do?
I'm not to start my video. I'm not sure why it went off, but it's okay.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, yeah. So just a couple of things, and I know that we're talking about cases. But I'm wondering, there has been so much conversation in light of all of these cases and these decisions about expanding the court. And there's a lot of conversation about, thank you, Dana, about how the court is so openly politicized now that there is no trust that these decisions are being made based on law, but that they are being made based on politics. And so as you all look at the decisions, in your view, are these decisions being made based on law or based on politics? So question one. And question two, how do you all feel about the question of expanding the court and expanding the court at this time? Would that be a decision based on what is really good for the country, or would that be a decision based on politics?
So anyway, I'm going to start, since you started a couple times, so give you a little break.
Give me some time to think.
So your first question is, are these decisions based in law or are they based in politics? So I think it's a yes and for both of them. A good lawyer is able to make any legal argument based on the law in front of them, and they're able to craft their answer to reflect the law and what their interpretation of the law is. So that's kind of like, we're all able to make all types of arguments given the face of the law, because laws have ambiguity and certain provisions that you could exploit to get where you want to be. The problem with this Supreme Court, and I think that's happened throughout history, I don't think the Supreme Court has, they sometimes work backwards, where they have the answer and then they have to use the law and craft the answer that they want to get to. And I think that's, and the misnomer is that everyone goes up before the Senate and says, oh, I will never let my personal opinions or my personal experience or my religion affect the way we handle and decide cases, which I honestly think that's a bunch of BS. There is no way in the world that your personal experience and your insight is not going to bleed into it, or if you're specifically very religious. I think it's all going to be balled up into one. And to say you could extract yourself from that is, I think it's just BS. I don't think it's possible. And if you remember back in the day when they confirmed Sonia Sotomayor, she said, I'm using my wise Latina experience and people jumped all over her like it was just like blasphemy what she was saying. But at least she had the wherewithal, and I think that's what we need, is to say, listen, I come with my own set of issues, I come with my own set of thoughts and beliefs, and yes, I have to balance that within how I interpret the law. If, like, let's just be honest about it and just kind of keep it moving and say what you say and just go on. Because now with the 3 justices, they said, no, Roe v. Wade is precedent. So we're not going to overturn it. Here we are, overturned. And then Susan Collins was like, oh my God, I'm shocked. They lied to me. And it's kind of like, girl, where you been? Come on now. What is that? Fool me once, fool me twice, fool me 3 times. This is what you get. So I think it's become political, but it's always been political. It's just always veiled as a matter of kind of like, oh no, I'm a neutral party, which I don't think that's ever a process. And what you also see is that over the time, people like Justice O'Connor, who was appointed by a Republican, she came around more of the liberal side. And it happened over time in different cases, and it really depended on the growth of that. But at this point, I don't know if any of the justices are willing to meet halfway or to kind of really think about the issues in a more technical legal way rather than personal or political endeavors. I don't know. Ani, what do you think about that?
I think, so my answer is similar, right? Is it political? Are these decisions political, or are they based in law? If you are a good attorney, you can convince anybody of anything in a brief, right? And that's why it matters who you put on the Supreme Court, because you should assume anybody who's nominated, they will be able to argue their opinion, and they will be able to find case law backing it up. So right off the bat, that almost kind of makes the question moot in a way, right? Is it based in law? They'll always find a law. They'll always find something to back up what they say. So then, is it based in politics? Yes, of course, it's based in politics. But when you get to the point where you are looking at stare decisis, a body of laws protecting the privacy of people's bodies and interactions, because a little bit of background of Roe versus Wade is Roe versus Wade came to be based on a Texas Supreme Court case about the privacy between 2 men having sex with each other. Sodomy, where Texas tried to make it illegal and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, you really can't interfere with what people do in the privacy of their own homes. And that case was used for Roe versus Wade. Well, you can't really interfere in people's privacy. And even at the time where there were conservative justices and liberal justices, all the justices could say privacy is the important issue here. Even in that case, I mentioned about the adoptions in Arizona. Justice Scalia was a very Republican conservative justice who said that the native sovereign nation had the right over the decision made on that child. So he did not just go with politics in that way, right? So just because a president appoints a justice just based on his politics, or her politics, it doesn't necessarily mean they're just always going to lean that direction. What we should have is more faith in our justices to think the way they should think. Yes, I have political leanings. Yes, I have my opinions, but I'm always going to weigh that in the best interest of the country, because clearly, again, the legislature failed at deciding this on behalf of the country. So I don't think you can avoid the political part. I think the Supreme Court has always been political. I think the Supreme Court has always been wishy-washy and gone back and forth on decisions. I think the shock value is a precedent that has been in place for so long, you know, affecting the lives of so many people on both sides of the aisle. I think that's what kind of brought the focus back on the justices, because I don't even remember in law school that much focus on the justices' political leanings. And I went to law school, I don't know, 10 years ago, right? It wasn't like that. Now people have more information. Now social media is educating people more, whether we like it or not. Now people are more vocal. Information is spreading really quickly. So now political leanings suddenly matter, when in the history of the United States, presidents have appointed people from the opposite aisle all the time to the Supreme Court. Now it's just, we know more and we're more equipped, so we should do better. And the second part of your question is, should we stack the Supreme Court, right? Because the Constitution doesn't necessarily have an explicit limit on how many Supreme Court justices there can be. There's just been traditionally, I think, between like around 9 and 12 or something like that. I don't think there's a limit. If I might be wrong, Christina, but I think I remember there's no explicit limit. Do I think we should stack it? Hell yeah, why the hell not? I mean, we're doing all this other wishy-washy phony stuff. I mean, I'm the person who's gonna always advocate whatever gets you the result. Whatever gets you the result. And if people say, oh, that's not what we've done in the past, well, in my past, I've never had to worry about not being able to get medical care for my body. So I'm always going to say do whatever it takes, because who cares? We're talking about the Constitution, a document that is outdated, a document that is not that relevant anymore, that the people who wrote it wouldn't care about me or any other person of color on this call or in this country whatsoever. They didn't write that with us in mind. They didn't write that document with women in mind. They didn't write that anticipating that the country they were founding was going to turn into something completely different than they imagined. So if we have to do certain things to disrupt the status quo, I'm okay with that. I'm not too committed to what we got going on anyway.
Thank you.
And my perspective on it, it's expanding the court. It's one of those things where it really challenges what I believed the justice system, or when I went to law school, what I thought was what we do as a country. Knowing the racial history, knowing the racial violence, knowing all of that, I still had faith that at the end of the day, there would be some measure of law and law abiding situation. Like you go in front of a judge and you should be able to present your case and they should rule on the facts and the law and how they apply. But that was my ideal when I went to law school, and kind of like rosy cheeks and all excited and all the rest of it, where now I've been practicing for almost 15 years. And I know that it's not true. It's not whatever case, it's so blatant that you as an attorney are crossing your fingers in hopes that when you bring a client to trial, that you get a particular judge. And that's what's so disheartening about the process, because if the law is the law and your facts are the facts, and however you present your case, how the outcome could really depend on who you're before. And that's not justice. And that's not a sense of the rule of law. So when you think about expanding the Supreme Court, what I worry about is, yes, I think we need to do something to change the status quo. But what I worry about is that once we start expanding, we get to put some liberal folks who we think are liberal onto the court, but then the pendulum will swing, and then the Republicans come back in and they'll stack the court some more. So at the end of the day, I think it just becomes essentially an arms race to try to get where we are, or what we think is the proper outcome. Where I think for me, the biggest question is, no matter who's on the court, and that goes from the Supreme Court to all the way down to other courts, what we have to really deal with is the systemic racism, the way that we are perpetuating laws and policies that are meant to oppress people of color. and to oppress other marginalized communities, LGBT group, women, like all of the people that had the opportunity, that all the people that the United States has the opportunity to oppress. That's how the laws are created. And how we need to dismantle that, which sounds like a Herculean task. But underneath, I think that's what girds all of the laws, is this idea that we need to uplift white people, need to uplift white men. And then speaking about white women, they will cut their nose to spite their face. They will always double down with the white men to maintain some of the power that they get for being white. So the Roe v. Wade is one of those decisions where people are up in arms, and I don't know if you've kind of followed the discussion that a lot of the people who are pro-life, as they say, which that's kind of a misnomer because they don't want to help babies after they're born. But one of the arguments was that Roe v. Wade is actually racist because about 50% of people who access abortions are people of color. And they're saying that abortion is targeting and eliminating Black and brown children from being born and children with disabilities from being born. So that was kind of like we're anti-racist because we want more Black and brown children to be born. And there's no real conversation of what happens when they're born and they're sitting in the foster care system and no one is adopting Black and brown children. So I don't know, those are my 2 cents about expanding the court. I get nervous, I get scared, but at the end of the day, I think we do have to do what we got to do.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up, Christina, on your comment about the anti-abortion propaganda around the fact that Roe v. Wade is anti-Black, which I find really fascinating because when you go back and look at the history of the anti-abortion movement, like 100 years ago, you find that white doctors are making the argument that abortion needs to be outlawed so that white birth rates will increase. And so there's a very anti-Black, at this point, immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe who are sort of in this quasi-white status. And the idea being we need to stop white women from having abortions so that the white population is not taken over by other populations. And so sort of seeing the way that race is used and twisted for different gains, and the ways that white women are really weaponized in a particular way, and in a way of promoting white supremacy through the very act of giving birth.
Thank you, Rebecca, for giving us some of that historical background. While we're on the topic of Roe v. Wade, and Adar, I know you had a couple of things to add. I wanted to get Christina and Ani's perspective on how Roe v. Wade and the direction that the courts are going, the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the direction that the courts are going in. How do you all see this being used as a weapon to criminalize people of color, to further criminalize them?
I think so Roe v. Wade was originally decided based on a privacy question, right? It was basically overturned in this latest case by saying there's no constitutional right to it. So a lot of civil liberties that people of color and women have, people with disabilities, etc. If you have a protected civil right that was determined by the Supreme Court, it's because of an interpretation of the Constitution. And if our justices now decide that, abortion is not a part of what was supposed to be interpreted from the Constitution as a right. Every single right that was extended to essentially anyone not white is at risk, because there was no explicit rights afforded to women or anyone non-white in the Constitution. So everyone should be alarmed. Everyone should be alarmed because the Supreme Court essentially just told the entire United States, we are going to read this document explicitly and interpret it in this very narrow way. So instead of where in the past certain rights were expanded, again, with certain conservative judges in favor of certain civil liberties being expanded to certain groups, right? We have a Supreme Court right now that basically just gave us a warning, essentially. Heads up, that wasn't a part of part of liberty for a US citizen. And a lot of the other rights that we had that we interpreted, especially civil rights, they're all up for grabs now. They're all up for interpretation, which again, this concept of, stare decisis, where you have a body of law supporting many states, many district or circuit courts, all supporting this general precedent, will just basically kind of be moot. And again, that is the frightening part. The frightening part is not just simply we have a lot of conservative justices. The frightening part is how essentially their function has now become ironic. Why do you need a Supreme Court if you don't need to interpret anything outside of what was explicitly written in the Constitution? What's the point? I don't know. And I saw in the chat, a couple of questions around like, well, if you stack it, if you expand it, won't it mean like the next time around in a different administration, you'll go the other way? Well, there's, my two responses to that is our weak legislature allowed for these 3 judges to be confirmed. So there's a process of checks and balances to appointing judges that I think failed to some degree. And allowing, I feel like that Gorsuch, I forgot how to pronounce his name. I feel like his confirmation was just very rushed. And then of course, Kavanaugh, we all know what's wrong with him. So we have a weak Senate that is not confirming anything. There's even issues with the judges in the circuit courts that are being appointed, right? That's just not as prominent and popular in the media to mention. And then the other thing is, we have the same amount of judges essentially for a population that's grown so much since, that initial number of 9, right? We have a more diverse population. The Supreme Court it does not directly reflect in ratio the population that it's making decisions on the behalf of. So again, maybe the pendulum will swing back and forth. Am I that committed to this idea of maintaining, the status quo? No, but maybe that's my extreme. I think this is all a joke, right? I think the concept of all of this is rooted in white supremacy, racism, sexism, misogyny, whatever. So if the pendulum can swing the conservative way, which it already has, too late, right? If we're talking about pendulums swinging, it's already too late for that. It's happened.
And along those lines, talking about essentially what the justices are now saying, the majority is saying that they're going to have construe like the originalist view of the Constitution. So it's very much like every word is sacrosanct. Like that's the bees and knees of every word is that's all that it means, and that they're not adding or adding any other type of rights to it. So that will now, and going back to Michelle's question about criminalizing people, especially people of color, it's going to happen because miscarriages, and I think that's going to be the telltale sign, like, can now someone who has an abortion say, no, I had a miscarriage, and try to hide the fact that they had an abortion? or someone who had a miscarriage is now accused of essentially having an abortion. So it cuts both ways in that regard, where I think right now there's no clean line as to who's going to be prosecuted for what. You know, are doctors going to be prosecuted for providing abortions? Are midwives going to be prosecuted? Like, are the women themselves going to be criminalized for seeking abortion? And what's so interesting about this whole thing is, like, where are the men? Like, where's the prosecution of men who get these women pregnant? That's not even, hasn't ever been a conversation or something we've ever considered. And that really goes to, once again, how we value people in the United States. And what you see, so Clarence Thomas, which he wrote a concurrent opinion to the case, he actually wants to take it a step further and say that all of the rights that come out of privacy, the sense of privacy, are up for grabs, that they can now go back and overturn cases that were decided to offer more rights to individuals based on privacy. So the one is having sex between two same-sex people. That was constitutionally protected. All the laws that were on the books, because the entire country had laws like that. It wasn't just Texas, but they that court case back in the day essentially said, outlawed those laws and said that those laws are unconstitutional. And what Clarence Thomas is signaling is that that's not enumerated in the Constitution, so it's up for grabs. We could now take another case, and I'm sure there will be another case coming up the pike that talks about sexual intercourse, however they want to define it, between same-sex couples. And the other part is going to be contraception. So contraception is also rooted in the right to privacy, and that will come into question whether or not people have the ability to decide whether or not they want to prevent a birth, which is just also very fascinating, considering the reason birth control was liberating for women. Like, they could now enter the workforce, they could plan accordingly, they could take care of themselves, they could end domestic violence by not being trapped into a relationship while pregnant. Like, the birth control was revolutionary to women's lives. So now what Clarence Thomas is saying, we could take that back. And he also attacks same-sex marriage, which that came about just recently. That's kind of like a newer expansion of rights to LGBT folks. And he's saying that comes into question because it's not enumerated in the Constitution. So, which is also very interesting, because Clarence Thomas is married to a white woman, Ginny Thomas, and somehow he missed adding the whole miscegenation as part of something that could be taken away. So he left that out, and he purposely did not mention that the right for a white person and a person of color to get married is not enumerated in the Constitution either. So it's just very much the hypocrisy of it all is what really is astounding. And then along the lines of hypocrisy, let me just go on to another one of the cases. The religious case of praying on taking a knee at the midfield and having a prayer session, and that the state was improper in firing them for doing that after being warned not to do that. So it's the whole separation of church and state. I just find it the most absurd and obscene conversation ever, because here we are saying it's unconstitutional to do that, to fire someone for taking a knee and voicing your First Amendment and religious rights. And then we have Kilpatrick, who he took a knee. He took a knee in protest of Black Lives Matter, and took a knee as part of his job, and everybody's yelling. Kaepernick, I'm sorry. You saw how I try to make him Irish. So I think it's just so bananas that they're saying they were saying he's working and he doesn't have the right to have freedom of speech or to voice his opinion about Black Lives Matter and the violence that Black people are facing. And he got blackballed and not allowed to play. Whereas all of a sudden, a Christian white man is taking a knee and praying and bringing along his students with it is okay. So it begs the question, and I hope to see this. I know the Satanic Temple is filing a case because they want to have satanic prayer at the half line. And I hope, I hope all of the other religions get in on it and start praying at the half at school. But anyway, that's just like the hypocrisy of it all is kind of highlighted in that particular case in such a egregious way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Christina, when you start talking about that case, so if a Black Muslim teacher wants to pray with his students, is that gonna be upheld by this case? So yeah, so thank you for making that point. I want
And
to.
it should be upheld.
Right.
It should,
right.
but will it? I don't think, I think the racism and the, they'll find a caveat.
Right. I wanted to swing back to Adar's comment about, Adar, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, just about Supreme Court. Should there be some limits? Like in every other job, there are, there is mandatory retirement or mandatory retirement where regardless of the experience you hold, nobody is going to hire you. And Supreme Court justices put on the bench lifetime terms so that they would not have to worry about running and therefore pleasing the electorate or anything like that, but they get to stay on the bench like forever. And should there be any type of retirement age, and piggybacking on Dana's, what she added to it, any term limits? What do you think?
I don't think a retirement or a limit on terms and forced retirement will change anything. Mm-hmm. In fact, you kind of risk, so a lot of people who are nominated to be on the Supreme Court have many, many, many years of experience. So they don't get on the Supreme Court until they're maybe in their early 40s maybe, but typically 50s. And then if you have a forced retirement age of whatever the average retirement is, 67, 65, you will basically have a justice, the term being like 10, 15 years, meaning you will have a lot more change. And then again, the risk of precedent changing a little bit more often, I think, will be higher. But ultimately, if the suggestion is because, again, the justices are just, they're staying on and too long with their terrible decisions. And again, I think the process of confirming them, has to be different, has to change, has to reflect the population better. But yeah, I don't know if the result we want necessarily happens by putting a limit to the term, unless it's something I haven't thought of or I have an argument I haven't heard.
Thank you. And I wasn't thinking about it so much for political reasons or for, get them off as much as, like the whole thing with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I
was pissed about that.
Yeah.
I was like, girl, you knew you had the opportunity to retire and get someone put in, but she hung on tight. But also that also talks to sexism, right? And whether or not we tell women when and how we should, because that conversation hasn't really been taken up about male justices. Just recently, it started being talked about with what's his name? I'm having a moment. The one that's just retired. Right. Breyer. So that was actually a political move where they were pushing him out to have so Biden could appoint somebody. But before it used to, the whole retirement age was not even a thing until Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I was pissed about that because I was very much like, she had many bouts of cancer. But I don't begrudge her the fact that she wanted to continue her career.
But here's my thing about it, though. I mean, and it's something that you said, Christina, when you talked about that the Supreme Court justices, that it's not supposed to matter what party they belong to, because they're supposed to come to the bench thinking that it's not about their party, it is about what is the best for the country. And so if that is at least what is supposed to be aspired to, right? I mean, people are asking the same questions about Biden running again. It is the same standard that is going to, be for you all in your jobs, for us in our jobs, when we hit 67, 70, 72. Why is the Supreme Court or even the presidency above that when in our workplaces, this is what any other average citizen has to deal with and what they have to adhere to?
Well, and I know for the legal field, you could work as long as you want to work. There's no, unless you're a particular a judge in a particular state that has that cap. Maryland does have a cap, but I could work till I die, and that would be okay with my profession. And I've seen people who have dementia who have continued to work, even though they're incapacitated to some extent, but they're not that far gone. But there is, there is that risk. And the other thing about the legal profession, which is different than other professions, is the sense of accountability. Like, for example, for judges, when you ask a judge to recuse themselves for some type of impropriety or look of bias, and it just has to be a perception of bias, it doesn't have to be true bias. You put a petition in for a recusal to that same judge, and that same judge reviews the petition for removal and decides whether or not they're biased, that they couldn't decide on the case. So that in and of itself speaks to this autonomy that attorneys have. And look at Clarence Thomas is another example, how he ruled, he ruled to stay in against the case against January 6th and the president's documents, even though his wife was part of the insurgents and kind of like the protest and stop the steal. But he said, no, I'm fine, I'm good.
And that was just what I was thinking about, Christina. And I don't know in any other workplace, if it looks like you stole money, you get to sit on the investigative panel about whether you did steal money, but yet you get to do so here. And yet we don't have conversations about how this makes Supreme Court justices like the presidency above the law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's above, there's no law, right? There's nothing limiting them. It's not above the law. There is no limit in place currently. If you think about it, again, when these rules were written, I don't think people lived as long as they live now either, But I wanted to quickly touch back on the case about the coach who prayed in school. And just for legal purposes, for everyone watching and listening, just to highlight what made it different than Colin Kaepernick taking a knee working for the NFL. You have a right to practice your religion free from government interference. That is what that amendment and that constitutional protection is. So now I'm not saying I'm for or against. What I'm saying is the way the coach's attorneys were able to be persuasive was because he worked for a government entity, right? He worked for a school. And his practice of his religion was interfered by the school because his contract was not renewed to stay at the school, et cetera. Whereas in Colin Kaepernick, worked for a private company. Oh, damn, my earphone. Can you guys still hear me?
Mhm.
Can you guys still hear me? Okay. So Colin Kaepernick worked for a private company that, you know, they're allowed to set their own rules about how people engage and how people do whatever it is that they want to do. And hopefully a company will do what's in the best interest for their profits, right? And will make decisions that will benefit the company as a whole, and they wouldn't suppress the opinions of, you know, their star employees like their football players. Hope that's what the hope would be. But technically, Colin Kaepernick's right to expression by way of the Constitution was not actually infringed upon, right? Because he was doing it at work for a private company that he worked for, and this goes back to what Christina and I were talking about. You can really convince anybody of anything if you're an attorney. We go to school for 3 years to figure out the ins and outs and the black letter law to make it fit whatever the argument is, which is why it's so important that the judges who are in charge and responsible of hearing these arguments and being persuaded, they're the ones who can hold that middle ground, right? And really kind of see something for what it is. But that prayer case, as outlandish as it sounds, by a legal standard, right? By a legal standard, that argument isn't too crazy.
And I think the issue with this particular case is that it comes into conflict with the separation of church and state. And so you have these two arguments of you have the right to practice your religion without government interference, but then we as a nation have decided you have to have separation of church and state. So this case actually blurs those lines and makes it much more difficult to tell where one starts and where one ends. And to go to Ani's point about private companies versus government agencies, Chick-fil-A is a perfect example of this issue, that people protested, they because of their anti-LGBT fundraising, and they donate money to people who want to eliminate those rights. And a lot of people will say, oh, that's against, you can't do that to Chick-fil-A because it's their First Amendment right to speech and their religion. And it's like, no, they're not government agencies. So we could boycott, we could say all types of things about Chick-fil-A because they're not the government. And we have the right to do that. So that kind of goes really to the point of Ani saying it's really specific as to government interference with the right to free speech and religion.
And there is no separation of church and state. I mean, I know we're not that disillusioned. I mean, there are Supreme Court cases that allow courts to have nativity scenes outside, crosses outside of their building, and the Supreme Court, no matter if it was liberal or not, has allowed this, right? There isn't really, we're a country founded on like Puritan Christianity, so we can pretend like there's a separation. And I mean, I don't know why anybody believes.
Oh, Baltimore City Council opens with a prayer. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, when I worked in Georgia, the judge used to always lead us in prayer before the court cases. And I was like, okay, I see what we're doing here. But that's what I really love about the Satanic Temple, is that they're bringing their lawsuits because they're like, hey, if you want a nativity scene, I want my little pentagon with the little lamb's head, not lamb's, but a sheep head with the beady eyes. They're all about it. I'm into it.
Thank you, Christina and Ani. Are there any other questions at this time? So we have about 13 more minutes left. Any questions that you've been holding that you want to ask? Something you want to discuss? Feel free to do so now.
Anything you want to complain about, because we want to give space for that.
That's true.
Anything you have rage about?
Yes, anything you want to commiserate about, feel free to do that as well.
I know we didn't talk too much about the gun case. I'm conflicted about that one because honestly, a lot of people of color I know when that ruling came out, they were like, great, now I can go, like, I have less restrictions on getting a permit for conceal and carry now. Which, and I've heard it mostly from Black folks. And I can't, I'm full disclosure, I'm Canadian, by the way. And I did not, the Canadian Constitution does not have a right to own a gun or possess a gun. The Canadian Constitution doesn't even have a full right to freedom of expression, actually. In Canada, you can like literally go to jail for hate speech. So it's a little bit different for me because I'm not really in tune with a gun culture, but I've noticed in recent years more people of color, specifically Black folks, feeling the need to arm themselves, to be trained, and I cannot say I blame them. You know, I cannot say, even though I'm uncomfortable with weapons and guns, and I've never felt a need to have one, and I've never grown up with this idea that I have a right to have one. I've also never been, my body has never been in danger in that way. I have never felt like at any moment a government entity like the police could kill me and get away with it, you know? So yeah, of course the ruling is uneasy for me, because I'm not, again, a big advocate of weapons and guns and people's access to them. I also kind of see the nuance where, you know, folks feel like now they have better access to that, what they feel like is a way to protect themselves, whether or not that's true.
Well, historically speaking, guns were unregulated that back in the day. And then when Black people started arming themselves, like the Black Panthers, and all of a sudden regulations came into play. Like once a large number of people of color, Black people specifically, started getting guns, then they started regulating assault rifles and all of that stuff. Like that was the impetus for regulation, was because Black and brown people were getting guns. So I don't know. I'm kind of with Ani. I was like, let's arm all the Black and brown people. Let's make this happen and see what happens with gun regulations, because I know white supremacy will not stand for us to be armed.
And Anthony just asked, how will it be enforced? It feels like it was for white people. It was for white people. This is one of those few cases, you know how like all the cases that were supposed to be helping women and women of color, people of color, and white women benefited from it. This might be one of those very rare situations. I don't know how quickly anybody can start enforcing against people of color having access versus white. To answer that question very briefly, I mean, they again, very much recent in American history to regulate weapons in general. It's not done very well, even in the few states that try.
Yeah, I think that Anthony made a good point with Philando Castile, very good point. But I think that also what I'm thinking about in my concern, and we don't have Stand Your Ground here in Maryland, but I'm thinking about the incident recently in downtown Baltimore between the squeegee worker and someone who got out of their car and attacked children with a bat, and how the narrative is so much so that those kids did something wrong, they are criminal, not the adult who was in his 40s, and if anyone knows that intersection of Baltimore, it's very hard to find a parking spot. And that's literally like the hardest place to park downtown. But he parked his car, went over there, and then attempted to assault children with a bat, right? And so I think that that's my concern about, I'm like Ani, like I'm not Canadian, but I hate guns. I think it's a bad idea. I really am uncomfortable with it. But I'm also uncomfortable with the fact that our courts are not going to see Black people as victims, even when they are being victimized, even when they are defending themselves, even when they are saying, hey, this is self-defense. My worry is that it's not going to be interpreted that way in the courts.
I was gonna just say, well, a few things. Hey, everybody. Just a reminder that we do have like 2 events through BRJA, probably on our YouTube channel, talking about Black people and gun ownership. So you should check those out. But also that, like, I think the reality is the more and more I get into this is that I kind of already know that like the people aren't gonna protect like Black and brown people. I think that's kind of like that's sadly the point, and that we know that they're not going to protect us, and furthermore that we are seeing, I think, the beginning of well, very long beginning rather, of just like a lot of kind of like infighting in this country. So a lot of this has kind of been a long time coming, and the way that we see with the January 6th committee, like, you know, commission stuff, we see it with a lot of like the oath keepers and, you know, kind of the assault on the right, that we're seeing a lot of this kind of like quote unquote race war stuff kind of like becoming a lot more tangible for people. And so I think that a lot of Black people are like, oh, well, if they have guns or they have weapons, obviously I'm going to need to have to protect myself and my family. And I think that, you know, it's a very scary space to be in. And I think that, like, you know, there was a question earlier about, you know, if the Supreme Court, if it's the law or is it politics that's running it. I mean, I think that we're definitely in a political space. Like we always have been, but it's becoming a lot more, you know, realized like just how political. We saw people sit up and say, oh, well, this is just kind of the standard law. We're not going to go after that. I feel like everybody who has some sense knew once they got enough people on that court that law was gone. Mm-hmm. I don't know how the Democrats didn't know. That's a whole other meeting. That's a whole other event. But like, we knew what was going to happen. And this idea that if we just have a few people who are going to be willing to do X, Y, Z, like that's not the trajectory of our country right now. And I think that that's what all the more like discussions about the Supreme Court, who's on it, who should be on it, should it be term limits, should it be abolished? Like that's also a question. Like, do we still need it? Like, is the Supreme Court something that needs to continue in this country? Is because what I'm seeing, the trajectory of all of this, is that it's not really, it doesn't matter about the kind of good old, well, I'm going to hold both of these things in my hand. I have this duty to do that. It's a lot more like, this is the world that I want to live in, so I'm going to create it, and you all will have to deal with it. And if you don't like it, you can try to leave, or we will find a way to get rid of you. Like, and that's kind of like where we are. And so I think that that's also, like, when we're talking about having these topics, I think that we have got to speak very plainly about what the other side of all of this is, like what the actual point of all of this is. And like, you know, the Constitution is something that did not include me or a lot of people who were in this, you know, event. We were not thought of. And so the fact that we continue to kind of go back to it, like, you know, this Book of Amun-Ra is very strange. But that's the world that we live in. And maybe the Book of Amun-Ra was not a good example, but you get the point. So
thank you, Julia. I'm curious if Christina or Anna, you have thoughts about kind of what Julia was speaking to about the integrity of the court, right? That because we're living in this time that is so racially tense, which we're used to here in America, but how do you feel, what is your opinion on the integrity of the court, given that these conservative judges are just like so gung-ho on, we don't care what the majority thinks, we're doing this?
I used to think it was a privilege to be a Supreme Court justice. Like that's the, you know, in terms of legal sphere, it's like one of 9 out of this whole body of attorneys. You actually don't even have to be an attorney to be on the Supreme Court. It's not something that is publicized. But I used to think, oh, you know, like, oh my God, imagine if I, like, when Sonia Sotomayor got appointed and she's the first Latina, that I was like overjoyed, over the moon, like, oh my God, I see myself having that possibility, right? Knowing that chances are I'm not, because I'm not that bright. But now, after these last 3 or the last couple of appointments, I'm like, this is garbage. Like, this whole thing is garbage. you have people who've never tried a case, who've never really had to go before a judge, and their experience is lackluster. So it's almost like it's mediocre white people getting onto the highest court. And I think that's what it comes down to, is that the mediocrity, once again, is being rewarded because of the color of their skin or how they politically align. So that's kind of how I feel about it now, where I'd rather do something else with my life than be a justice.
Thank you, Christina. Ani, did you have anything to add? Or closing thoughts? Well, I think Adar did have a question.
I was just
Question might be too big. I know, y'all know me. So I'm just gonna ask if it is a yes or no. And that is, when you look at, I mean, we concentrate on the Supreme Court, but when you look at all of like the circuit court judges and those that I mean, Trump put in, or his administration put in like more, and that has slid under the radar, but we see the impact of that when there are decisions based on wrongful deaths, killings by stand your ground laws or police shootings or whatever, for mostly Black people, right? Do you feel that the way in which even the circuit courts have changed puts Black lives at risk? And Christina, you and you, Ani, made me think of this question when you all were talking about the fact that the rights that we thought were rights, they're not in the Constitution, and therefore the courts can strip us of the rights that we've come to rely on at any time. Do you see that happening even at a circuit court level? Yes or no?
I would say a lot of circuit court decisions that impact what we know as rights, right, that are not necessarily enumerated in the Constitution. I would say most circuit courts are left-leaning, and you're seeing that, right? You're seeing a lot of circuit court judges trying to delay the inevitable. I would say circuit court judges also have less focus on them, so less pressure, I would usually to be political. So again, the problem is when a circuit court decision is appealed up to the Supreme Court, then it is what it is, right? It's going to be what it's going to be. But am I afraid of that impact? I have noticed most circuits in the country, and I have been out of practice for a few years now, so just disclosure, typically are trying to avoid this from happening. Mm-hmm. And then it's up to the appeals process to go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will either take it up or affirm whatever, right? Or even sometimes when they don't take it up, they're still affirming it. But circuit courts are usually that place of refuge, and you just hope it isn't appealed up again, usually.
Thank you.
And it all really depends on like where the circuit sits. I think for the most part, like you have the California, and it's mapped out into different circuits. The South and Texas, they're right. But I think Ani's right that some of the other circuits are quite open to maintaining rights. Whereas,
and can you answer the question that Rebecca posed in a chat? Because I'm interested in that too.
What is that? Oh, hold on. Let me see. Sorry.
Yeah, she talks about the Supreme Court case about the federal court not being able to overturn a state court decision, even if new evidence comes to light.
The criminal case? Is that a crim case? I think that's a crim case.
Yeah, it was a criminal case, like out of Arizona or something, and some people were convicted of murder, and
so that's
bad representation, and yeah.
So that's different, right? Then again, it's a different set of laws, right? So there's certain rights in the history of the United States that have been relegated for state decision, right? So certain rules, like marriage rules, right? Then recently that changed with gay marriage. Certain rules historically are always relegated to the state. Certain rules are usually relegated to the feds. Crim law is one of criminal laws are usually state-based, and it is very difficult to overturn a state Supreme Court criminal ruling. And most federal courts do not want to do that. They want to adhere to the state constitution and the state decision on whatever those outcomes are. And I think the test to overturn a decision from a federal court of a state decision is very difficult to pass. I don't remember the name of that case. And if you're asking like my opinion or our opinions of that difficulty, that difficulty has impacted Black people specifically the worst. Because again, the state courts, they will always pretty much affirm their own law enforcement and their own judicial system. And it's very difficult to get that all appealed up to the Supreme Court. It takes many years to even get an appeal to the Supreme Court and to even be heard. Most are not, obviously. Changes in precedent made by the United States Supreme Court for criminal law is usually always very momentous, especially I would say in the last like 30 years. Again, because there has been like growing like leniency. Now that's swinging back. That pendulum is swinging back, and you can see that. So yeah, that's just my take on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ani and Christina, for giving us your legal insights on this. And I know we all learned so much this evening about just a little bit more about how our government is working and how the Supreme Court is working so we can be better equipped. I just want us to all be keeping in mind what we talked about and how the law is up to interpretation, right? And so is so it's up to interpretation, right? And so we talk about here at BRJA how all of our institutions are rooted in racism and white supremacy. So if we're leaving that up to interpretation in a racist and white supremacist country, these are the outcomes that we are now having, unfortunately. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this discussion. We will be talking about the effects of environmental racism next month. I know it was one of our cases and we didn't really touch on it too much, but we're definitely going to be going much more into the depth with that next month on August 13th. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.